after the Exodus, the escape from Egypt, just to get everyone caught up, remember where we are. The crossing of the Red Sea, the giving of the Ten Commandments, the people of God were led to the land promised to their ancestors, to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. The land that they had been told was flowing with milk and honey. When they arrived at the border to this land, they sent out 12 spies to do recon. You can read about this starting in Numbers 13. 40 days later, when the spies returned, 10 of them gave a report, they might have been Presbyterian, which ranged from cautiously realistic to outright pessimistic. The people who presently inhabited the land were massive. The Israelites wouldn't stand a chance if they tried to go in and occupy the territory. 2 of the 12 spies, however, presented an opposing view, something a bit more optimistic. Believing the report of the 10 doubters, the people of God lost heart and they rebelled. They raised their voices, weeping and grumbling aloud to Moses, "If only we had died in Egypt or in this desert. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us be slaughtered by the sword?" Very melodramatic. Well, this cut deep into God's heart. God had already rescued them from the Pharaoh by having them cross the Red Sea on dry ground. God had made water appear from a rock and food from the sky to nourish them in the desert. God had given them 10 words, 10 best ways to live, 10 rules for living in covenant community with God and one another. And yet, even despite all of that, here they were complaining again, accusing God of leading them to slaughter. Well, the Lord was incensed. So the Lord said to Moses, the co-parent, "How long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the miraculous signs I have performed among them? I will strike them down with a plague and destroy them." But Moses interceded once again for their people. More importantly, Moses reminded God of God's own character. "Therefore," Moses said, "let the power of the Lord be great in the way that you promised when you spoke, Lord, saying, 'The Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but by no means clearing the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children to the 3rd and 4th generation.'" Which I think gave God an idea. "Yes," God replied, "yes, I do forgive, just as you have reminded me. Nevertheless, none of the people who have seen my glory and the signs that I did in Egypt and in the wilderness and have yet tested me these 10 times, none of them shall see the land that I swore to give to their ancestors. None of them shall see it." And that, ladies and gentlemen, that is how the Israelites ended up wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years. Preachers love making jokes about GPS and maps, but this is the real reason. God was a creative disciplinarian. God declared that for each day of that failed recon mission into the Promised Land, the people of God would spend 1 year like nomads in the wilderness. None of them would live to see the Promised Land. Maybe only their children at best, but more likely their children's children. God did not smite the people of God that day. God put them in a geographical time out. I spent a lot of time in time out as a kid. I know that's shocking. I'll let you take it up with my mom. The neat thing about time out, or time in as they call it nowadays, is that once you get your big feelings out, you're actually, the rage and the frustration and then the guilt and the shame and the cycle. Once you get past those feelings, you're actually left with some good time to think and process. So this is the case with the people of God who spent the next 4 decades wandering around the wilderness together. They had lots of time to think and rethink, and what I think is most important, reimagine. It was during those 40 years that the motley crew of freed slaves and refugees, because remember, it wasn't just the Hebrew people who escaped Egypt. At no point in history are the people of God a homogeneous group. Come on now. That's important. It was in those 40 years that they went from a ragtag group to being formed and reformed into a nation, like kneading dough to make bread, into a community, a people made up of tribes and families. They learned unity without uniformity, a unity that they had never previously experienced. Which brings me, oddly enough, to the Tabernacle. Long before it was the name of a famous choir, the Tabernacle was a movable house of worship. It was, as you saw in Monica's story and then again in the video, a massive tent which was outfitted with all sorts of religious tools and ornaments. And on the inside, the innermost sanctum, the Holy of Holies of the Tabernacle, that's where God would dwell among the people. Up until this point, God is still manifesting in the great pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. But now God was commissioning a dwelling place, a sanctuary. God gets Moses to take up an offering from the people. It's like the first capital campaign. And invites skilled men and women to get to work collecting and planning and sewing and creating and building the various parts of the traveling sanctuary. I loved when Emily said, that's a lot of stuff. It is a lot of, she's rebuilding it right now. I have the bird's eye view. It is a lot of stuff. Well, it turns out the people were so enthusiastic about this project that their offerings exceeded the need. What a nice problem to have. And so the tabernacle, over time, was built. And throughout the 40 years, the people of God got quite skilled at taking it all down, packing it correctly. I love how it took 3 of you to pack it up. That's perfect. And then they would find out where they need to stop, and then they would put it all back up again. Sometimes they would camp out for a few years. Other times, maybe only a few weeks or even a few days. They learned to watch for and listen to God's leading, to trust God's leading and God's presence. And they learned how to be a community, bound together by this shared experience of assembling, disassembling, traveling, and reassembling the tabernacle. In psychology, there's a whole field of study devoted to the concept of groups and how groupness is formed. How they form, why they form, what their life cycles are, and the gains and losses of being part of a group or not. One common feature of creating a kind of group or community is a shared initiative or project. Consider a community garden or a Habitat for Humanity build, or in school, a group project. You remember those? That you research and present together. It is my belief that the tabernacle had this effect on the people of God. It was a lightning rod for their time and energy, talents, and treasures. It drew them together. They had to work together. And not to be overlooked, frankly, this was more than just a project. It was the focal point for their life of faith and worship, too. Tabernacle-driven worship and ministry gave their days and years a pattern, a flow, a rhythm, even a calendar. It was a place to go to have sacrifices made, prayers offered, disputes settled. Together, they created this center point for their life as they worked out what it meant to truly embody and live out the covenant with God, their life of faith in community. By the grace of God, the tabernacle was this massive group project, and it gave the people a focus, a level of organization and governance, and it taught them how to be a new people, God's people. You heard me say a couple weeks ago that the easy part was getting the people out of Egypt. I believe the tabernacle was part of the hard work, the long game of getting Egypt out of the people, reprogramming them. They were no longer slaves. They were free to be in relationship with God and with each other and creation itself. A nation was formed in the wilderness. I've had the privilege this fall to meet several individuals and families to talk about church. I've talked to young people seeking baptism, and I have spoke to parents looking for baptism for their babies. I have talked to people who have been in this church, in this community for their entire lives, and I've talked to folk who are newer to the area and brand new to Knox. As I reflect on all of these conversations, a theme has continually come up in the nature of this thing we call church. As Connie wrote in her reflection at the outset of the latest Knox newsletter, fantastic devotional, by the way, please go and read it. Quote, being part of a church means being part of a community of people who are trying to follow in the way of Jesus. And that's hard work. It's like a never-ending group project. The Tabernacle lasted for 40 years. We've been doing this for 2,000. The assignment is to follow Jesus, who gave us instructions like, go and make disciples, and feed the hungry. Jesus said the greatest commandment is to love God. A second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus told us to pray for our enemies, to turn the other cheek, and to wipe the dust from our sandals if we leave a place where we are not welcome. Jesus modeled all of this for us by eating at a lot of people's homes, turning water into wine, upsetting authority figures, breaking or at least bending religious law, and hanging around with people whose mere presence tarnished his reputation. Thanks for that. Helpful. So a church is a group of people who choose to work together on this strange sort of assignment to be conduits of God's love and grace in the world. And like the Israelites in the desert, we just keep an eye out for God, and we set up shop wherever the Spirit leads. And this is hard work. It was hard work then, and it is now, because people are hard work. Each and every one of us comes to the table with our own ideas, our own preferences, our own backstories, our own traumas and triggers, our own hopes and dreams, our own ideas about how things ought to be done. And we step on each other's toes, and we get frustrated with one another and surprised by one another. It's messy and complicated, and it's beautiful, and it's full of risk. Love always has an aspect of risk to it, but it's life-giving. At its core, church is intentional community making, seeking to follow Jesus as we strive to be an inclusive, intergenerational, and open community. Draw the circle wide. Draw it wider still. There's always room for more. So going back to our scripture reading for today, one of my favorite stories in this whole period actually comes shortly before the passages that Phil read to us. And it's going to lead into the next thing I want to share with you. And it's about Moses. Moses is absolutely burned out because he's spending every day just managing the Israelites, hearing their disputes, their complaints, problem solving, envisioning, and planning. He's tired. It was all too much. It was relentless. And so Moses' father-in-law comes to pay him a visit. And old Jethro, which is a fantastic name, by the way, pulls his son-in-law aside one day and says, hey, that's enough. That's not sustainable. You got to delegate. Appoint some others to function as leaders among the people. Spread out the work. Here's the thing about that advice. Delegating doesn't just alleviate the load on the leader. It can also empower and equip others for ministry. Again, messy, because people are messy and beautiful, but it's a much more sustainable model. So in the 40 years that they wandered in the deserts, putting the tabernacle up, taking it down, traveling, putting the tabernacle up, putting it down, traveling, The Israelites were led by Moses and his leaders, his elders, and they worked together to build and maintain their house of worship. And God dwelt among them, refashioning them into God's people, a people of the covenant. That is a sermon on the tabernacle. And it brings me to our series focusing on ministry at Knox and what it means not only to be a church community together, but what it means to be part of Knox Oakville specifically. For some of you, this is just a refresher, but for many, this will come as new information, actually. So let's start at the beginning of this breakdown. I won't spend a whole sermon on this, don't worry. Knox Oakville is a member of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. A Presbyterianism, is a Protestant denomination birthed out of the Great Reformation of the 1500s. So we've been around for a while. And unlike the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, Protestants move away from governance by a pope. That's a key difference. So what's a Presbyterian? Well, it's all Greek to me because Presbyterian comes. Can anyone read that besides Joe Drake? Comes from the Greek word presbyteros, which means elder. An elder is one elected and ordained from among the people, among the congregation, the community, to provide leadership and guidance. Like Jethro advising Moses to delegate leadership. And unlike elected officials in our communities outside the church, P.S., don't forget to vote. There's an election coming up. Elders aren't representatives of the people. Elders are elected because the people have identified in them gifts for leadership. They make decisions based on their obedience to God and their own conscience. So, elders, presbyteroi, are the elected leaders of a Presbyterian congregation. When they meet to pray and make decisions, they're called the session. And their meetings are moderated by another elder, the teaching elder. You know them as the minister. And this is how all Presbyterian churches are governed, all of them, by the session, led by the moderator. Here's what that looks like at Knox, I think. Yeah, there's some of the pictures. I couldn't find all of them. In fact, if you are an active elder on session currently, could I invite you to stand, please? If you are a current active elder on session. There we go. There we go. There's some of them. There's not all of them, but there's some of them. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. One quick extra piece of information for you. Because Presbyterianism doesn't follow an episcopal model, that is, we don't have popes or cardinals or bishops, who has oversight of individual churches? What prevents a Presbyterian church from going rogue? Well, the presbytery. The presbytery is what we call a corporate bishop. And it's a court composed of the minister and a rep elder, a representative elder from each congregation within a predetermined geographical area. When something goes wrong or is to be celebrated at a local church, the presbytery has oversight. When ministers are inducted into a church, the presbytery comes to that church to lead that worship service. Knox Oakville is part of the Presbytery of Brampton. I am part of it, and I come under its oversight. Knox representative elder on the presbytery is Will Thompson. This model of shared leadership repeats over and over and over again. Elders, 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 teaching and ruling, all the way up through all the courts of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. The highest court is a General Assembly, which meets annually to review and provide oversight of the whole denomination across the country. All right, that's enough of that. Back to Knox. Session, as a court, not as individuals, session as a court is responsible for and has oversight of all aspects of the life and ministry of the church. which is manageable for the vast majority of Presbyterian congregations whose membership averages 75 and under. Larger congregations require larger sessions, that's us, because it becomes a lot of responsibility and a lot of oversight. So in its infinite wisdom and faithfulness, Knox Oakville decided to try adding something new and different. In 2000, we attempted to create a new model for ministry in which the session could appoint individuals within the congregation to serve as, get ready for it, cluster coaches. This is unique to Knox. This is not a Presbyterian church in Canada word. You will not find cluster coaches in other Presbyterian churches. It is unique to our structure here because we just had to be different, didn't we? We can't help ourselves. What is a cluster coach? Well, the role of the cluster coach, technically, is to facilitate, encourage, equip, enable others in ministry. So this means that sometimes a cluster coach will lead a ministry where they're passionate about it. Sometimes they're just going to participate in a ministry. Other times they don't participate in it, but they advocate for it. They're lightning rods for concerns and support to others in their own ministries. Cluster coaches work in collaboration with one another, and they report to session regularly. All the ministries and programs of this congregation fall into one of our clusters of ministries: faith formation, operations, music and worship, outreach, and pastoral care. Supporting these 5 are 3 others: communications, stewardship, and I've put new roads in there because it's new roads, our renovation project. This is what makes us Knox Oakville. Part of something larger, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and also uniquely ourselves. So on a very simplified level, our leadership looks like this. Session functions as a court of elected and ordained ruling elders. It has oversight for the whole congregation. The session has appointed and empowered others, the cluster coaches, to serve as champions, advocates, leaders, coordinators, encouragers of various ministries to the congregation and beyond. And it's those cluster coaches that over the next few weeks you're going to hear from, and people who lead ministries in their respective areas. This morning I tried to slide into the next one, tried to capture, you can't even see them all, but these are some of the ministries that fall under those various areas. I didn't capture them all, I assure you. My hope and prayer over the next 3 more weeks is that putting names to faces and highlighting ministries and opportunities will help each of you feel empowered and encouraged to get involved, to start new things, and put your own time, talents, and treasures to good use. Wouldn't it be marvelous, like the people of God in the desert, if we had so many offerings we had to say, whoa, slow down? That would be incredible. Just like the Israelites in the desert learned how to become the people of God as they did life and ministry together, we too at Knox Oakville in 2022 are learning and relearning how to do this life of faith and ministry together. It is a never-ending group project, truly. And I, for one, couldn't imagine doing this with anyone else but every single one of you. Whether you've been at Knox for generations, or a decade or 2, or for the first time this morning, whether you're in worship in person or online, whether you're a captain or a teammate, no matter who you are, this community of faith is better because you are here, because we get to do this together by the unending grace and patience and love and hope of our God. The tabernacle may be a thing of the past, but the people of God, as the dwelling place of the Creator, continues on in us, even now today. For that, we can and do give thanks. Thanks be to God. Amen.